So, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Ranger4 webcast. My name's Helen Beale, and I'm the head of DevOps here at Ranger4. Today, I'm joined by one of our DevOps delivery experts, Craig Pearson. I'd like to say hello, Craig.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Ranger4 DevOps Maturity Assessment. Today's webcast is going to be about 30 minutes long with some questions and answers at the end. So, the agenda of what we're going to cover today is we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about DevOps itself. We know that most people listening to this may already be familiar with the DevOps movement, but we thought we'd do some conversation around what we think it is and why we think the maturity assessment is so important. Then we'll cover where to start. We'll look at the DevOps Maturity Index and how that relates to the assessment itself. We'll look at the process behind the assessment and the deliverables. And then Craig and I will go through a customer story with you. And finally, we'll talk you through how to get your own assessment. So first of all, we've just got a few slides coming up with some quotes from some key players in the industry around DevOps. And Craig and I thought we'd kind of have a little bit of a debate about what we think DevOps is, where it's come from, why it's important. So from my point of view, what I've seen over the past sort of 15 or 20 years while I've been working in the industry is a couple of changes that are quite key. And one is the increased critical importance of applications to organisations. So where IT, but perhaps in the past, was something that kind of ran the back office. Now, most enterprises of whatever age have software as a key part of their business. So what that means is that the developers in all the businesses, the software developers, are being asked by the business to deliver more and more innovation in order to compete and in order to satisfy consumers' requirements around social and mobile and other things like that. At the same time, we have IT operations staff that are responsible for system infrastructures that, again, have over the past few decades have grown into and evolved into very complex, sophisticated architectures with very heterogeneous application environments, often lots and lots of interactions and integrations. And the IT operations teams are often rewarded and tasked with keeping those, what can be quite fragile systems, stable. So we have kind of two conflicting forces. We have developers being charged with innovation and change, and we have operations wanting to keep everything stable and not to change these systems that can go wrong. And that causes some conflicts. And at the same time, there's opportunities there by taking away some of these conflicts to do things faster and do things better. Craig, I know you have some cultural comments to make as well on that. What would you add to that?
Yeah, but there's a couple of things to add on that. Just to mention that since we've had the recent explosion of virtualization in the data center and the advent of software-defined infrastructure and infrastructure as a service, increasingly we're seeing development activities playing a key part in the delivery of operations. And that does require a fundamental culture shift within businesses where traditionally what we've seen is this silo mentality of operations staff and development staff, being distant. Through the advent of DevOps, it really is about unifying that team and embracing a culture which is for both sides to pull together to deliver a better service, be it a delivered software service or a quality infrastructure.
Great. And this is a quote from John Willis, who's one of the very well-known characters in the industry. And again, he brings up this point about how DevOps can make or can prove that IT is a strategic advantage. So again, kind of bringing home that the sense that IT has moved on from something that runs the back office, it's something that can really make or break a business's plan and goals. I quite enjoy this quote from James Turnbull at Puppet Labs as well, because fundamentally my background is as a salesperson, so I find it amusing that he winces that sales should be involved in this process as well. And I think this is a good point, that more and more people are recognising that even though DevOps, naturally we're talking about development and operations, there are actually lots of other people that are involved in improving this process and ultimately improving the way that software is defined and the way that software reaches the ultimate consumers, whether they be traditional business or B2C type users of that service. And in fact, when we talk a little bit more about delivering the assessment in a moment, you'll see how we try and include these those other people from the business that aren't necessarily IT or development or operations.
I think that's important because the DevOps movement is not just about the tooling, although at the moment there seems to be major investment, being made by the tooling vendors in terms of marketing. DevOps is very much a cultural shift which will require process change within organizations, the way they do their activities, but also organizational change in terms of reorganizing the structure of the business to allow DevOps to happen. It isn't just about getting a DevOps engineer or installing one of the latest tool sets.
Absolutely. Like, I quite enjoy this quote from James Turnbull as well. Although, and this is something that might be interesting to debate as a group one day, it's like how there's a lot of pain that James is communicating here. He's, saying broken, really, really broken, potential toxicity, and I think it's interesting to see whether people really feel that it's that bad at their environment, at their business, or whether it's more of a kind of state of continual improvement that they want to achieve. We have a couple of tips coming up during this presentation. My first one is there is a video on YouTube from AppDynamics called The Real DevOps of Silicon Valley. I find it very amusing. I will warn you, there is quite a lot of swearing in it. But what it does show is what James was just talking about, that quite often at the point of, for example, an outage, a environment change happens that's kind of like a boiler room, or there's a war room that's created and a lot of blame goes on. So the failure of the system creates a huge amount of kind of panic and, as I said earlier, blame. So everyone's pointing fingers at each other, trying to say who's done something wrong, while madly trying to scramble around and fix this thing. Everyone's working late, getting called out at weekends. There might be a hero that kind of gets called in and fixes it. But I find that video very amusing, so highly recommend that you watch that. Again, we just wanted to talk a little bit. We've had this slide for quite a while now, but we just had a go at updating it, Craig and I, yesterday, because we were thinking about, first of all, that DevOps is a relatively new term and it's extremely hot at the moment. I'm sure all the people on the call or listening to the recording are aware, and we've all seen the stats of the amount of jobs that are being posted now with DevOps in the job title, and we could debate endlessly whether DevOps should be ever in a job title. And we talk to customers, and we hear a lot of customers telling us that actually they've been doing DevOps for sort of 15 years, and they've been bringing systems and development people close together, but it's only recently that they've known, or they've had something to tag it with, so a name to call it. So I think it's generally accepted that Patrick Tabral was the father of the term DevOps, and it was very much a grassroots movement. Initially, it started as a hashtag on Twitter. It popped up at some events like Velocity, and I think that's interesting for us as well, because in some of our customers we're seeing that they're driving it forward as a grassroots movement as well initially. So we've done quite a lot of work on papers around DevOps for CIOs and DevOps for CEOs to try and explain to the people, right at the strategic top of a business on why they should be looking at this. But we know that there's a lot of interest throughout the IT departments anyway. Sort of more recently, in the last year or two, we've seen the big vendors get involved as well. So we've seen some very interesting acquisitions: Urban Code at IBM, Nolio at CA, Furnace at BMC. So the big guys are starting to realise that the people like Puppet and Chef, who actually have been around quite a while now, are onto something, and there is definitely an automation opportunity, and there is some business value behind this DevOps message. Craig, did you want to talk a little bit more about what we were thinking DevOps looked like in 2014?
Yeah, what tends to be happening around about 2014 and beyond is we're seeing a few key things. One is the concept of a software-defined everything, or the term SDX. Historically, with hypervisors like VMware, we've seen software-defined servers and infrastructure come to the fore. But since VMware took over Nicira and with the onset of the OpenStack Neutron project, what we're seeing is the concept of software-defined networks as well. So effectively, what we're building towards is this whole software-defined data center, which is pivotal to DevOps capabilities. What we're also seeing much more is the commoditization of cloud providers and the integration and support cloud providers are giving to some of the DevOps tools that you're seeing on this page. So, for example, it will be possible to pick and choose your cloud vendor, whether it be Amazon, Google, or whoever. If you've underwent a DevOps transformation, which allows you to define your data center using some of these DevOps capabilities through software definition, you really will be able to pick and choose your cloud provider, giving you much better value for the money you're spending on development and operations.
True, and I think that's kind of the next thing we're leading to, isn't it? Now we all know what DevOps is about, and we get an understanding of what DevOps can bring in terms of benefits on getting innovation to market faster, making working environments a lot more pleasant to be in, all of the productivity improvements that can happen. The next thing that people ask is where to start. But just before we go on to that, our second tip for anybody that hasn't read it yet is we highly recommend that you read the Phoenix Project. It is a novel about DevOps. It's a very entertaining read, and it's by Gene Kim, Kevin Bear, and George Spafford. And Gene Kim in particular talks about the three ways, theory of constraints, the idea that if you make an improvement but it's not a constraint, then the improvement is actually an illusion. So if you if you make something faster, all you're doing is accelerating work to the bottleneck, or effectively creating a vacuum after the bottleneck. So I highly recommend you read that book. And then moving on to the next point. So we now know DevOps is here. We understand why people want it and the benefits it could bring. So the main question we get asked next by people is where to start. And our answer is always start by baselining. So you can't know where you are and where you want to go, or where you're going, if you don't know where you're starting from. So this is really why we started to develop the DevOps Maturity Assessment. And alongside that, we also identified an opportunity to develop the DevOps Maturity Index. So we have a calculator that considers various different elements of your current state. So in the past, when we've been working with software development lifecycle and application lifecycle management, we've often talked about people, process, tools. It's been like a mantra. You must look at people first, get the right people in the right roles, get your organizational structure sorted. Then you can look at the various pieces of process. And then finally, you can look at tools. And there is a kind of a mutual dependence between process and tools. A tool won't work if you haven't got a process driving it. But conversely, a process can never fully be optimized, or arguably can never be fully optimized if you don't have a tool to support and automate and speed it. In the DevOps world, we're starting to talk about culture, interactions, and automation, which are pretty much the same things, but more DevOps terms. I think this is partly coming from John Willis's acronym about what DevOps is all about when he talks about CAMs, so culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. One of our other delivery team particularly likes to talk about CALMs as well, so he sticks L in there for lean too. So we've developed our maturity index at the current state. So we've done a number of surveys and integrated the one-to-one customer engagements that we've done as well. And the current industry average that we've come up with is 63. We suspect that's slightly skewed at the moment because the kind of people that were filling out the surveys that we publicise on the web tend to be people that belong to things like the LinkedIn groups on DevOps, following DevOps hashtags on Twitter. We're involved with DevOps Days and some of the big events out there. So generally at the moment we're seeing slightly lower scores for the people that we're doing actual assessments with one-to-one. But the great thing about giving you a single number that is your DevOps state number, if you like, is that then we can keep on measuring you as we move past the assessment and into initiatives beyond that should be making improvements, and also see where things aren't working so well, where we might be failing a little bit, and what we can do to tweak that and make improvements. And a big part of the DevOps culture is about motivating and encouraging staff to work effectively. So it's really important that we learn how to reward success and recognise success. And again, the DMI is a very clear, short, sharp way of us showing how to do that. Now, Craig, I know for your tastes, I've probably talked a little bit too much about what one does after one's baselined now, but perhaps you'd like to talk us through a little bit more about how we do this piece and what sort of things we're scoring on.
Yeah, I mean, having gone through this a number of times now with various clients, I would like to elaborate that they are sometimes surprised at the focus we do place on cultural characteristics of organizations. A lot of organizations think we are going to just focus on the tooling and the process. And some of the questions in the assessment process may seem a bit strange, but it's all about getting people to look inward at their current culture and just try and find out what are the cultural barriers to embracing DevOps. The process itself is very much an interactive process with meetings and interviews and workshops with people from across the business. Again, not just within dev and ops, but in terms of with the business owners, with the business leaders, and with various other ancillary teams to DevOps, and really trying to bottom out how well they are progressing against a number of different dimensions. I mean, just to give you a flavor of some of those, within the culture dimension, we look at how willing the organization is to embrace failure. And what we tend to find is that failure is something that is strongly resisted and sometimes buried by organizations because of the fear of what failure brings. And that really is anathema to the DevOps movement, which really is more about doing things quickly, doing things earlier. If you're going to fail, it's best to fail early in the process rather than when you're running services in production. So it is critical to sort of get an honest and open viewpoint across the organization. Other aspects around the tooling is how well established some of the tooling capabilities are. Whether there is suitable tooling in all of the steps across the continuous delivery process, whether requirements management's in place, whether the configuration management's in place, what the monitoring environment is like, how well they react to spikes in traffic. Do they have the capability to monitor, to expand, and to have resilient infrastructure? The process dimension takes an element of agile, in terms of how fit is the organization to do things quickly. But it also looks at the multiple handovers that organizations typically have, from requirements through to design, through to development, through to test, through to operate. It really is a process of baselining an organization on clear and unarguable metrics. We then feed those back to the management team, to the organization, and to the contributors to make sure that we've got everything right. And ultimately, this builds into a complex Excel model that gives the DMI score. And just to confirm, the DMI is a score out of 100. So that a number of clients have gone through this, and they do feature at different extremes of the spectrum. There are some who are pretty proactive with regards to DevOps. There are those organizations who are small and who haven't begun their journey yet. But in the main, what we're seeing is something in the middle, which is let's be honest, DevOps is one of the major buzzwords in the industry at the moment. So a lot of organizations think they must be doing something. They tend to start by giving somebody free rein to look at some of the DevOps tool chain. And that really is sort of something that gives a lot of organizations an early to mid score. Realistically, you've got to look at these other two dimensions of culture and interactions to make your organization more willing to embrace the whole DevOps movement.
Absolutely, and thanks for clarifying that was out of 100. I missed that, sorry. So the DMA process, and Craig just alluded to this in some of his description, but let's kind of take it from the top in terms of how we actually deliver this piece of consultancy. Typically, for most enterprises, we start by recommending 10 days. That's normally 2 sets of 5 days, so 2 consultants. We find 2 consultants works quite well because there's quite a lot of discussion that needs to go on about what we really think of that organisation's current state, particularly around the process maturity. However, that said, we are doing some engagements have been as small as 3 days, particularly with smaller IT departments where they perhaps don't want to do all of the interviews, so I'll come on to that in a moment, where they think actually a couple of focus groups would work better. And then we have had some very large ones with larger enterprises where there have been multiple divisions, and we've effectively delivered a series of multiple assessments in parallel to get a picture of the whole enterprise's state. So the 5 days each, or the 10 days in total, breaks down as a day sort of at the beginning for half a day of each of the consultants to do some preparation, and then we do a half day on site with a kick-off meeting with the project stakeholders, and that's really where we review the business drivers and the business goals and start baselining the current state, but also start visualizing the desired future state with that stakeholder team. Following that half-day kickoff, the consultants then break out into the interviews that Craig mentioned a moment ago. So typically in a 10-day engagement, there would be a day and a half of those interviews. They're 45 minutes long, normally do about 12 of them, 45 minutes with each person that we interview, and then a 15-minute break while the consultants have a chat about what they've just heard and make the notes and summaries that they need to and fill out the calculator. And then the next few days are around building the report, looking at the various initiatives that we might recommend, doing some work around prioritisation and a fit assessment. So sometimes there's some fairly obvious quick wins, but actually if we take a step back, there might be a bigger project that looks perhaps very challenging, but perhaps if we were to tackle that, it would have a much greater business impact. So those are the kind of questions the consultants are trying to answer. And then finally, we come back and we present the results and the roadmap and the recommendations to the stakeholders again. And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about James Turnbull's slide and when he winced at the potential involvement of sales in the process, that we do include people that are not just in development, not just in operations in this piece of the puzzle. In fact, in some of our assessments that we've done, we've had business development directors and chief executives even involved in this process. Craig, do you have anything else to add to this bit?
No, I was just going to re-emphasize that final point you made is that all of the desired future state is around building capability to support more frequent, more continuous delivery to satisfy those business drivers. You know, it's important that we get the leadership team involved in this process from the start, because the process is not about constructing a good technical solution. It's about aligning the delivery capability in line with the business, the business ambition. Everything else is ancillary to that.
So in terms of deliverables, as we've described, the first thing we do is baseline exactly where you're starting from. And one thing we haven't dwelt on too much yet, actually, is the kind of metrics that we've used. So we've talked about cultural metrics and the fact that we measure things like the company's approach to blame, the willingness to approach failure or how they handle failure, how teams are perhaps constructed, whether they're around skills or whether they're around projects, how knowledge is shared across teams, whether teams are multidisciplinary, all of those kind of things we score from a cultural perspective. And it is actually surprisingly easy to work with people to score on a cultural scale and even to measure improvements on a cultural scale. What's much more difficult around culture is actually assigning a hard dollar quantifiable value to change. We know that happier people are more productive people, but it's very difficult to actually say what that is actually worth to any business. However, there are other much harder metrics around things like volumes of defects, volume and frequency of release, MTTR, time of outage, all of that, those kind of things that we can measure and assign time and value to and build a business case around. So when we look at the vision for the desired future state, often we can say things like, okay, so there's 30 defects a week coming through at the moment. The desired future state is to bring that down to 5. Those defects are taking 2 hours to fix at the moment. We'd like that to be 10 minutes, and we can start building business cases around that. The consultants then, as I described, look at a number of initiatives across the organisation, across culture, the architecture, process and technology that we might or might not recommend as part of the deliverables. And they do a fit assessment and prioritise the projects across that. So what we end up with in terms of the deliverables is hopefully an approved project plan once we've presented it to the stakeholders. And what we normally find is that we'll make sort of 5 or 6 recommendations, and usually there'll be 3 or 4 that are really keen to be picked up straight away, and the project will break down into a number of work streams. So there's some typical examples of things that we might recommend there in terms of cultural change, some reorganisation, looking at specific processes, perhaps looking at specific tools and implementing and rolling out specific tools. And then you'll see in the red box that we've put continuous delivery there at the bottom, and that is often, but not always, the ultimate goal of the DevOps projects that we've been working with. And then again, to reiterate this point, because it's so important with DevOps, the metrics element is essential, and being able to quantify what we're doing, measuring how we're performing, and being able to assign value to our activities is absolutely essential. Craig, I think you had some stuff you wanted to say around continuous delivery here as well.
Yeah, I mean, continuous delivery, or even onwards from that, continuous deployment is sort of the holy grail of where we're going with this. The ability to move from concept, an idea, which will add business value, to actually realizing that value through a delivered service and infrastructure is key. And one of the metrics to mention there is that, organizations currently have pipelines of doing that currently in the many months time frame, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility to move that to a matter of days. And even in the best in class, to within a same day, you can have an idea in the morning and have it delivered as a production feature by the end of that day. It really is about moving to that continuous delivery model. And let's be honest here, a lot of organizations are embracing this concept, and those that move quickest and who reorganize themselves to do continuous deployment will be the ones that win the market share. They'll be the stronger players moving forward. So from 2014 and beyond, we'll start to see, some of the market dynamics changing. Those that embrace DevOps will be able to have their capabilities quicker, and those that don't will just start to wither and die effectively. So continuous deployment or continuous delivery is a key thing.
Definitely. And here's another tip. If you haven't already, there's some brilliant DevOps Cafe webcasts. It's been a while actually since I've listened to any of them, but I think you've been onto them quite recently, haven't you, Craig?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, some of the latest topics are around things like the software-defined network and software-defined storage, and basically software-defined anything. There's a few experts out there in the wider world. The DevOps Cafe is good in that it's very agnostic of any tooling or fashion. It just tells it like it is, and has some really good guest speakers.
So finally, let's talk about one of the DevOps maturity assessments that we've delivered. It was a financial services company that came to us saying initially that they thought they needed a testing tool and they were experiencing a high volume of defects coming through from their development team. We felt that we often see with defects that actually testing isn't always the answer. It's not tackling the root cause. So we suggested to them that we undertook the assessment to see if perhaps the defects were effectively being created by something further upstream. So Craig, do you want to talk us through what you discovered when you went in?
Yeah, this organization were using a third party to deliver their software as well. So there was a complication in that they didn't have complete control over the end-to-end process. So trying to position DevOps within that was they thought was somewhat difficult. But really, through a process of consultation and getting to grips with the key stakeholders involved in this, both internal and to third parties, it immediately became apparent that there was process barriers in the way. Everybody had acknowledged those, and it just took a metric, a benchmarking exercise like this one to clearly identify where the bottlenecks and the issues were. I mean, there was multiple handovers of information within and across the organization, something like 10 to 15 handovers of basically similar content. And, that was effectively putting in place 15 different bottlenecks across the organization. They'd underinvested in tooling, which was, another metric that was quite easy to highlight to them. But the other side was this cultural blame manifesto which was going on, and it really did require a recomposition of the organization to break down some of the barriers that had been established internally and getting everybody thinking the end product, which was all about delivering value to their clients. The organization themselves were very willing to embrace change, and that is key. Anybody coming into this process has to know that change is a fundamental part of doing this. They can't do DevOps and operate where they are. It's all about making change, be it process, be it structure, be it tooling, to align everything so there isn't these bottlenecks, make sure everything is aligned and pulling in the right direction, again, to deliver the business value. As you can see there was a number of recommendations came out. I wasn't going to elaborate on each and every one of those. Testing was key to this. that was just one piece of the desired future state jigsaw, and that would be a story that everyone on this call would go through themselves. Their individual recommendations would all be different and would more than likely represent a mosaic of different pieces that would be needed to allow DevOps to flourish. Without doing a baselining exercise, without knowing where you are and on which dimension you can improve, it is very difficult to pull together a subjective plan of improvement. The DMA assessment is all about being, objective, about key metrics to deliver value, and it takes away a lot of the fashion and the politics and the hype that's at play within DevOps. In terms of moving forward, the organization are embracing the results with the view to improving their DMI score. So it's important to emphasize that the DMI is not done once and left on the shelf. It is very much an evolutionary process. Akin with Agile, DevOps is all about continuous improvement. And once you get that baseline and once you make steps down that improvement path, you can do the DMI again and see and track and potentially reward against visible improvement in that DMI score.
Absolutely. I think
with that, I'm conscious we've hit 30 minutes.
We have hit 30 minutes. We do have just one question, which is, how does test-driven development relate to DevOps? I think you're probably better placed to handle that one than I am.
These are all complementary. I mean, these are all complementary processes that are at play here. DevOps is about embracing all of the different features of continuous improvement. Test-driven development is all about, making the dev part of DevOps a much harder. It takes people away from writing code to deliver a capability and then testing it, which is the legacy waterfall mindset. We're flipping that on its head and saying, right, to develop something, I need to know first and foremost how I'm going to test that. And that could be the development of a service or the development of operational capability through infrastructure as a service. So anything that can improve the dev capability of DevOps is something that should be eagerly embraced. And the client we work with in the financial services sector, wholeheartedly took that on board.
And we just did have another question just came through actually. Moving straight into organisational change would require significant input from senior executive sponsors. Given many DevOps practitioners look at demonstrating results at a smaller scale and then engaging stakeholders to build on that, what is the rationale for putting reorganisation so early in the typical project plan?
I mean, a couple of points there. It is key that the stakeholders are bought into this from day one. It's not something that can be undertaken as a skunkworks, which some organisations are trying to do. You may get limited success, but you'll not get the movement towards continuous delivery that is needed. It may be that you benchmark as part of this process and then you experiment. We're seeing that with another client, which is where we were setting up an agile capability to break down the barriers, to focus on a particular release of a product. So they were trying their current legacy ways and having a smaller agile team working towards DevOps. It really is, again, about the organization's appetite for change. What we are seeing is, even if you do try small scale, you will still have that difficult reorganization step to take at some time. But by doing things small scale, sometimes you prove that things work and you get some improvement metrics, which can help justify to senior management the need to change.
Yeah, and I think
a key final word on that is, you can't do DevOps, typically with your current organizational structure, unless you come from the startup mentality, unless you're somebody like a LinkedIn or a Living Social, who have started with DevOps. It is inevitable that there'll be some legacy structures in place which just are barriers to making continuous delivery happen. This process is all about highlighting those.
Yeah, and for years with big type IT projects, we've used that analogy on how do you eat an elephant, and you cut it up and do it piece by piece. So I guess when we, organisational change, it could be an entire enterprise organisation, or we can look at pieces bit by bit. One other question that's just popped through, which I think may be slightly related to the first one we had actually, or triggered by it. The relationship between DevOps, ITIL and Agile, how do they all relate to each other? Just interesting because I had a similar chat this morning. And it was interesting because I was asked the relationship between Agile and DevOps, and it was suggested that operations didn't kind of have anything equivalent to Agile, and we started talking about ITIL. And ITIL, I think, from my understanding, is a lot more restrictive than Agile, but it is trying to bring some controls into the operations process. So I think DevOps is an extension and a crossover of both of theirs, with perhaps more flexibility than ITIL. What do you think, Craig?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they are complementary, and I can speak from some experience here. And that a recent client of mine were and still are embracing ITIL, but what they had is somewhat long-winded and cumbersome change approval boards and advisory boards and steering boards. And as a process, it was fine, but with the process in context was very long-winded and was very much a bottleneck to delivery. Through DevOps and through the provision of things like automated testing, by providing to senior management evidence of robustness of delivery capability, the need to so rigorously and manually apply ITIL started to diminish. The process itself will not go away, will still need to be embraced, but you will be able to push more through the ITIL process through the use of DevOps capabilities. I'm sure everybody on this call, knows fine well the change review board, that really does protect the production environment, and ITIL sort of supports sort of that as a process. DevOps and continuous delivery is about making that not necessarily go away, but certainly become much more streamlined and efficient. What you want is more value, more capability going into production quicker, and without the huge bureaucracy and the huge process that some organizations currently put in place.
Agreed. Okay, so that is the end of our question and answer session. So I think one final thing, or two final things remain for me to say. First of all, if you're interested in getting your own DevOps Maturity Assessment, please do email me at helen.beale@ranger4.com. And finally, thank you, Craig, and thank you everybody else for your time today. And I hope you enjoyed this webcast. Thanks, Craig.
Okay, thanks for listening, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.